Explaining Explainability. In this podcast, we bring together the different disciplines of the Collaborative Research Center Constructing Explainability. Two researchers discuss a concept around explainability from their point of view. Moderated by Professor Britta Wrede.
Hello, welcome to this episode. Today we're talking about context. And so imagine you're asking an AI a question like how a medication works or why a decision was made by an algorithm, but the explanation you get uses many mathematical concepts that you haven't heard of, or is way too technical, or way too basic, or just not helpful. So what's going wrong? But often the problem isn't the information itself, well, not alone, but it's the context. So the system doesn't know who you are, what you've already understood, or what kind of answer you need. And in real life, we humans are constantly adjusting explanations depending on the situation. So whether we are talking to a child, a colleague, or a doctor, we use our knowledge, our memory, and also our joint experience in the ongoing interaction to grasp what's going on, and we adapt on the fly. For AI to explain things in a meaningful way, it needs to do something similar. It needs to understand and respond to context. And today's episode is all about this challenge. So how can explainable AI become more context sensitive? And what do we mean by context? Why does it matter? And how can we model it? To dive into these questions, we are joined by the researchers Friederike Kern and Benjamin Paaßen.
Benjamin Paaßen is Junior Professor for Knowledge Representation and Machine Learning at Bielefeld University. Their research focuses on machine learning for structured data, explainable AI, and the application of machine learning in education.
Hi, Benjamin, welcome here.
Hi, Britta. Thanks for being here.
Friederike Kern is Professor for German Linguistics and Didactics at the Bielefeld University. Her research deals with learning interactions in everyday life and at school on the basis of videographic studies. A particular focus is on multimodal resources and their significance for interaction and linguistic learning.
Nice to have you here.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me second time.
Yes, I'm happy to have you. So welcome and nice to have you here. So in this episode, we'll talk about key takeaways and surprising insights also of the conference that took place last summer here in Bielefeld. And the idea is also to talk a little bit about the next big steps towards AI systems that explain things not just correctly, but meaningfully. And so, Benjamin, you co-organized and hosted the conference, Contextualizing Explanations. And Friederike, you chaired the session on foundations and concepts for, context and explanations. Could you explain from your perspective what do you mean when you say an explanation should be context sensitive? Or maybe you could give an example where you encountered maybe the influence and relevance of context in your research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we built in our research group AI systems that are supposed to be used in education. And their context is very immediately relevant. So take the example of a chatbot which is supposed to explain stuff for a certain course. Then if the chatbot is just a general language model and you ask it a question like, what does lambda mean? Like the Greek symbol lambda, then of course a general language model could only respond in that terms. Like this is a Greek symbol probably. But of course in the context of my data mining course, it has a specific meaning, indeed several meanings. So you would not only need the context that you are in my course, and that it could be, for example, the rate parameter of an exponential distribution, or it could be an eigenvalue of a matrix, but even which specific part of the course you're currently talking about. And ideally, the system is able not only to understand the context as such, but to ask you a question if it is ambiguous. So ask backwards and thereby clarify what context you are currently referring to, and maybe offer you different options.
Wow. So that sounds really interesting. And is your AI already able to do that?
No, not really. But we definitely noticed the relevance of it even in just building up evaluation data sets. So we noticed that language models, if not adjusted for context, tend to come up with questions that are super ambiguous and that we had to throw out of the data set because they were lacking the respective context.
I see, yeah. So thanks. That's I think that's sort of refers to reference resolution from a linguistic perspective. So, Friederike, what would you see from your perspective?
Well, coming from human-human interaction, context sensitivity would be something that actually people among themselves, co-participants, negotiate with each other. And I think this is one of the major challenges to kind of to bring this into AI systems, because this is something we do constantly, as you also said in the introduction, on the fly, adjusting our context, adjusting the way we talk, adjusting what we talk about, and also all our multimodal resources we use on the fly while talking to each other. And so this very dynamic process is, of course, a huge challenge because with all the ways we have of perceiving things in our surroundings, this is something that, of course, a system cannot bring about. So, yeah.
I imagine. Yeah, and I also imagine that it's difficult already to operationalize the influence of context. So I think you did that just very nicely, Benjamin, with this reference resolution, actually. But there are many other things, of course, that take part in that. Do you also have the feeling, so when I look around in different disciplines, I see that context is an important notion. And I'm wondering, do you see that also in AI, or are we the first ones to discover that?
No, I don't think we are the first ones as such. I think in classic AI in particular, it has been a huge topic, switching between different contexts, and therefore, for example, knowing which part of a knowledge base is currently relevant and should be triggered. In more like recent notions of AI and algorithms in AI, it has perhaps been a bit lost or only implicitly encoded, because there was this super big influence of end-to-end deep learning, where we basically said as a field, we don't need to engineer all this context explicitly anymore. We just throw all this human understandable stuff away and we just let the machine train on data. And then I think the turn backwards is now very much in our TRR to make it indeed explicit again what context we are talking about, and thereby make it explainable and interpretable.
But couldn't one argue that actually, if we have so much data, really big data, that the context is already in it in a way?
Not in any specific interaction context. Like if you talk to a large language model, I would argue you still need to do the work of disambiguating context if you are talking about references, but also many other things. It just makes a difference if your counterpart, if the user has a certain background knowledge level already or not. And this is an intrinsically ambiguous thing that the LLM can just not know at the beginning of the conversation. And right now, I think rather experience LLMs that seem superficially plausible in their responses and answers, but don't actually do the work that would be required to make it properly. And their training also goes partially against that notion, because they are trained to satisfy us in one turn of the conversation, whereas I think our approach in the TRR is rather to have a multi-turn interaction, which over time constructs a shared notion of what needs to be explained, how does it need to be explained, what is the prior knowledge, and so on. And that can be frustrating and time-consuming for a few turns. Therefore, the training of an LLM rather tries to cut it short and rather suggests that, no, I already understood you, here's a perfect answer, which is not true, but that's what the LLM is trained to do.
That's a nice way of framing it. So, yeah. And Friederike, would you say, is this the dynamic that you talked about?
Yeah, this would be one part of or one dimension of the dynamic, indeed. Yeah, so like asking questions, referring to previous turns in the conversation, and also referring to other aspects that might be visible or audible or whatever. But this is definitely this dynamics that we are talking about when we're looking at human-human interaction, which would be quite a challenge to transfer.
And actually, this to both of you, have you already worked explicitly on the influence of context in your research so far? I'm asking this because now in the second phase of the TRR, we are focusing on context. And have you done that so far? Or well, will it be a big challenge for you to do so in the second phase now?
It depends a bit on what you treat as a context variable and what you treat as a core variable of the scenario, not so much as context. But one context variable that is always very important in our research is the current knowledge and ability of the student we are trying to teach. So there are dedicated algorithms which do nothing but monitor that. So in the TRR terminology, monitoring in our terminology is usually called knowledge tracing. So we observe a sequence of tasks that the students do, and they could do it right or wrong, and depending on the sequence of responses, so the sequence of correctness and wrongness, we make a statistical estimate of how well overall they are doing and whether they have mastered the underlying concept or not. And that is a context variable. This underlying mastery is something we typically consider.
Okay, I see. So that's really interesting. And maybe, one last question in this first part. What would you say, if now coming back to the conference, what have you felt were for you the most interesting insights that you gained from the conference? Both of you.
So one of our keynote speakers, Kaspar Sokol, was also in some respect inspiration for our TRR, I think, because he made the observation early on, I think about 2020 already, but please correct me, that basically this constructive notion of explainability was missing, that a lot of explanation approaches in machine learning were not really evaluating with human users at all. And then when he did the keynote now in 2025, basically nothing much in the field had changed, and we were almost the only ones who really did this systematically. And therefore, I think one of the key takeaways from the conference is still that there is a special place for the research the TRR is doing, and that we are kind of the biggest initiative in this direction, which I think highlights the importance of the TRR. What I also like is that we really saw these three different streams of foundational concept development and empirical research, and then the computational approaches. But we also see that they are not yet fully connected. So we don't really see so much, for example, context in the computational approaches yet, whereas in the conceptual development, maybe we are farther in the empirical research, but Friederike would maybe know more about that.
Well, maybe to go back to your first question, whether context has actually played a role in like my research and will play more role in the next phase. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it always plays a role because wherever I collect data, they're always like situated in a certain environment, and people do something together, and it's very different whether I look into a classroom or whether I look, I don't know, in explanations like we did here in the TRR, where like two students explain something to each other, and the challenge is then for me or for us is not to kind of see this context as pre-given. It's like, oh, we have a classroom and there's like the tables are put up in a certain way and there's students there and there's a teacher there. So, of course, people behave like or talk like. But the challenge is to provide evidence for that the co-participants in these given situations actually make relevant certain aspects of this context, because of course in a classroom you can have a chat with your neighbor, or you can do gossip, or you can do all kinds of other things as well. So it's not the case that once you are in a certain environment that you behave in a certain way, and this kind of also very flexible treatment of context is something that we very much like to look at, or I like to look at in my research. And another aspect which I think also connects really nicely with what we are trying to do in the next phase in the TRR is looking at explanations, for instance, but also at other conversational activities like storytelling. We all have, as part of our language socialization, certain expectations about what a story entails and how it is structured, and of course the same with explanations. So we have certain expectations, and these expectations are kind of worked along during the during the production of an explanation, and then context factors of course come in, and to kind of untangle this and to see, okay, we have this structure and we need this structure, and this also has to be fulfilled, otherwise we wouldn't recognize an explanation as an explanation but as something different. But then also seeing the dynamic aspect of it and trying to provide evidence that, for instance, certain context factors come in here and change the course of an explanation in a certain way. This is quite a challenge, but I think it's really it's very interesting from my point of view, and also hopefully very fruitful to look at in order to make to transfer to other areas.
Yeah. So thank you so far for the first part and for the introduction actually of the topic. Context is such a big concept that is difficult to grasp, and I think you made it really tangible here. In the next part we are now going to have a closer look at specific research questions. You already a little bit touched upon that, and maybe also some conference topics. What would you say are the most important factors to consider when adapting an explanation to a specific situation or person? So, for example, I have many examples from health sector. So, for example, when a doctor explains how a medication works to a patient, how is that different from explaining it to a medical student or maybe a child? So, what roles do prior knowledge and maybe even language or cultural differences play? I mean, are they really all important, for example? So, I don't know, does an AI need to know about cultural differences, for example?
I think it's an empirical question, actually.
Yeah.
Like for some kinds of explanations, or for some things this might be important, but for other things it might not be important. So I think we would actually need research about this. But when it comes to prior knowledge, I think this is really important. So like the examples you just gave, I think that makes a lot of difference. What is interesting about this, it's not the case that, for instance, I know I talk to a doctor now, or let's say I'm a doctor and I talk to a medical student. So from the beginning on, of course, I draw I conceptualize my explanation differently than talking to a patient. But then in the course of the interaction of the explanation, of course, I would also always see and try to find out how far does the prior knowledge actually reach, and do I have to provide more information about a certain aspect or not. I might, of course, I adapt language-wise as well. I might use more medical terms or less medical terms and so on. But this is many of these things, again, I do on the fly rather than having I might have a rough idea about this beforehand, but then I try to do this on the fly. And I think that this makes actually very good explanations. And I see this a lot in classrooms, for instance, when there is questions from students and teachers provide an explanation, and sometimes they're very adaptive in their explanations, and sometimes they are not. They just kind of provide an explanation, and they don't really adapt to, for instance, by asking questions or whatever, adapt to find out more about the prior knowledge of the student, or about what they actually want to know, which can also change, or where the gap of their knowledge is, for instance. And so I think this is one of the aspects, or this is an aspect that would be really important to adapt that's a really important context factor.
Yeah. So now that's interesting, Benjamin, because that's exactly what you're doing, isn't it?
Yes, partially. So I think it is a very important engineering challenge to operationalize your context, or define rather your context correctly, because Katharina also very eloquently said, or cited rather, that context can be a black hole that swallows everything. So you have to be a bit precise about which context variables you actually want to model and need to model to make a situation work. And the one thing that we already discussed now a lot is how do you have to adapt, for example, your explanation to different contextual variables. But what we also want to consider, for example, in our project is whether there is differential impact of the explanations and the interventions we want to have. So in our project, which is named Healthy Distrust, we want to provide explanations that do not raise trust, but rather distrust into a large language model, because our hypothesis is that there's rather currently a bit over trust into large language models on the student side, and perhaps some students would profit from being a bit more, skeptical would be one word, but having this gut feeling, this healthy distrust that maybe something's off right now. The unfortunate bit is, though, that these interventions that we do might have adverse effects, in the sense that if we tell you that currently the LLM might not be reliable, for example, because the answer might be wrong, you might misattribute that to your own actions. So you, as a student, you might think, oh, I did something wrong. I asked the wrong question. And if that, for example, happens more often, if it happens at all, that is already a bad sign. But if it happens in particular more often for certain demographic groups in our population, that would be particularly concerning. So that's also a reason why we consider context in particular, for example, socio-demographic context variables.
I see. Yeah, so this brings me actually to the question, maybe first to you, Friederike, how do you, when you analyze these interactions, how do you detect, let me say it this way, detect what are the relevant context factors here that you observe? I mean, that's not so easy, right? I mean, if you have them up front, that's great. But if you don't, how do you figure them out?
That's actually that is quite different, but quite difficult. But if we look at what we call sequential analysis, so if you look at the sequences of talk, we would see, for instance, whether when something remains unclear, then you would possibly see signs in the behavior of the co-participants showing this, or we would see follow-up questions, for instance, or also things like understanding checks, like have you understood, and so on. And this would always be signs that there's something going on, and that there's, for instance, when it comes to prior knowledge as a context factor, this is actually examined by the co-participants itself. With regard to other context factors, like, for instance, environments, like, as I said, classrooms or so, there is a lot of research showing that, of course, we have something like institutional communication. So within an institution, there are certain ways of communicating with each other, which we can actually also trace in the way the talk is sequenced, and one turn comes after another. And we often find this in very, very small linguistic units, this kind of orientation towards what our environment is, but also what we are doing here with each other. And for instance, in the second phase, we want to look at, in one of the projects I'm involved with, we want to look at how people explain fitness trackers to different people. For instance, we want to ask sports students to have a fitness tracker explained to them, and we would expect here, for instance, that of course they have a lot more knowledge about how this actually works, and also what they want from a fitness tracker. Whereas we also would like to look at elderly people who might have a medical who might have to have fitness trackers for medical reasons, and they will have very different needs, and also we expect a very different level of explanation. And rather than looking at this as some kind of pre-selected factors, we would here also again look at how do the co-participants, the one who explains, adjust him or herself to the co-participant, to the one who wants to know about their fitness tracker. And I'm pretty sure that this will be challenging, but maybe I'm sure we will see a lot of differences.
I can imagine. Well, relating back to you, Benjamin, how did you actually figured out that there might be specific groups or people who might fear that their question sort of broke the LLM?
So how we identified these context variables for our project was thanks to the community of the TRR as well. Like we discussed this proposal with the other colleagues here, you among them, and then the educational scientists actually alerted us to this specific risk factor and that we should consider it more deeply. Other factors were a bit more clear maybe from our setup already. For example, we were pretty sure that it was relevant how much prior knowledge students have on a domain in how they would judge the answers of an LLM and how much distrust they could develop based on that right away. And that healthy distrust itself is an important context factor to consider because that's what we want to intervene upon. We want to make it measurable in the first place, but we also want to be able to impact it with our explanation. So that was kind of clear from the outset. And that also makes clear that there are different kinds of context factors, also work done in the TRR, that there are not only these context factors that tend to be static across an entire interaction and that you maybe need to figure out, but maybe also you pre-select for them, but there are also context factors that might change over time or where you have intrinsic uncertainty about what their value is.
That's interesting. I think we will talk about that in more detail in the third part. So thank you very much for this insight already in the current and also your future insights. And let's dive into the outlook and vision now. You just said about the different context factors that can influence how explanations are actually processed or perceived. And how are you going to go about in the next phase to model that? Do you predefine, I guess you predefine the context factors that you are going to investigate and model?
Yes, in our case, we will do that. I think other projects will also go into how to discover relevant context factors during the interaction in the first place. But yes, we will predefine it basically. And as I said, there are some context factors that are a bit more static or in our case, situated context like the socio-demographic variables and prior knowledge maybe that we just might need to discover during the interaction, but they are basically fixed, at least for the length of an interaction that we consider. And then there are things that are a bit more dynamic, like especially the healthy distrust that we want to intervene upon and that we want to build during the interaction. Therefore, we will develop new psychometric tools to make that measurable, like, for example, surveys, questions, and instruments like that, and utilize them to also measure the difference. So how much healthy distrust did you have before an intervention with our system and how much after? And therefore, how much could we improve?
Okay, that sounds really interesting. And I'm wondering, because we have talked now a lot about these context factors and whether they are predefined or not. Well, this is, of course, based on the notion that we have actually established in the TRR about the context types. So we have these 4 context types, and I don't know if somebody of you would like to explain them.
Well, I could start, and maybe then you take over?
You co-construct them.
You co-construct, yeah. Right. We try to develop or conceptualize 4 context types that vary in terms of adaptability to make it more feasible for the goals of the TRR. So we would start, or the first context type would be the selected context, where all the context factors are actually pre-selected and they're stable. So a system, for instance, gets fed with certain context types that are supposed to matter, and that's it then.
Could you give an example? So would that be like your system, Benjamin? Would that be selected, or is that already?
So selected would be more like the academic subject, for example, we are in. We have fixed that in advance. If I selected that I run my study in my data mining course, thereby that is fixed because I decided this is a data mining course now.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, similar, like in one of my projects, it would be, for instance, the explanandum that's fixed as a context factor. So this is a fitness tracker, and this could, this would be, part of the selected context factor. The second is a so-called situated context where there is actually given parameters again, but these parameters can, like during the explanations, they can be then adapted to what comes up or what is considered necessary during the explanation.
I always understood it also in a way that we allow some variance, yeah. And before the interactions, we don't yet know what value kind of the variable takes. So this would be our socio-demographic variables, for example. We will for sure have some students with different socio-demographic background in our sample, and we don't know in advance which one it will be. And maybe the system will need to also adapt to different values of that, but we predefine still that we consider this particular variable.
Okay. And would also be the level of expertise be something like that?
That could be, yeah. I with some contextualization maybe. So the level of expertise might also change during education and during the interaction a bit. So I'm not yet sure where it would fall exactly.
Okay, so it might also fall into the next type,
which would be the adjusted. Yeah. There again, you would have some pre-selected factors, but a lot more variation actually that can again be adapted to the situation, to what's coming up during the setting. So like in terms of adaptability, it would be more adaptable than the previous context types, so would allow more adaptability.
Okay.
And would you say, Friederike, that, for example, if you have dynamic conversation where the explanandum might shift over time, that would be such a thing where you adjust to different focus of attention to a different explanandum?
Yeah, although there I think this could also be like co-constructed like then the last context type, yeah, where actually like from the beginning on you would try to negotiate, or you first, as a first step, you would have to negotiate what you actually want to know, what the explanandum is, and then kind of adjust step by step until you come to your explanandum and then to your explanation. But I think the difference, I mean, this could be part of it, but I think the major difference between adjusted and co-constructed is that in the co-construction, actually the history of the conversation, and this would be actually this, is also considered as a contextual factor, and negotiating about, for instance, the explanandum would be part of the history of the conversation, something that comes up during the conversation and is actually part of it as part of the negotiation.
Thanks a lot. The way you have just talked about context sort of is interesting to me, because it sounded like, so for me, I conceptualize this in terms of systems. So you have systems of type 1, 2, 3, or 4. But the way you just talked about context, it seemed to me that all context exists in parallel at the same time. Is that? Even Benjamin is nodding. Okay. And Benjamin, how do you conceptualize that in a system?
I think that it just means you treat these context factors differently. If you say, for example, we treat socio-demographics as situated context, that means you consider it as a static variable that you might have some uncertainty about, but basically the variable itself over the interaction will not change. And that also has technical implications if you conceptualize it this way. Whereas the healthy distrust that we treat as kind of the core variable of our entire system, and that we want to intervene upon and that we want to co-construct together with the user, is much more core to the system design. We expect it to change over the time. We want to make the effect of our actions on this context variable measurable and stuff like that. So you have to consider this in much more depth and much more detail. And I think it makes sense in system design to decide a bit explicitly in which context variables you want to focus on, making them co-constructive. But the mission of the TR overall is of course to go more towards this type 4. So to build systems that can deal with co-constructed context.
Okay, but I found it very interesting, again, the way you formulated it, that in the way you would say, well, we know about certain context factors, and we just treat certain ones just as static or selected or situated, others as adjusted, and some, probably just one, as co-constructed. So you really are aware of the context factors that you have, and you treat them differently.
I would say so.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, yeah. You just enlightened me. Thanks a lot. Yeah, would you see it similarly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, of course, when doing the research, I would always try to, as I said before, to provide evidence for a certain context factor, for a specific context factor to be actually relevant to the participants. But of course, there's sometimes they don't display to each other very openly what is important for them. But for instance, in the other project I'm involved in, we will look at the use of LLMs in different working contexts. And this is very explorative in terms of what contextual factors actually play a role here. So what would be a situation look like in which someone working in a firm or something turn to an LLM to solve what question, or to ask what question, or to solve what working problem. And so here we are actually very, very explorative with regard to the contextual factors we are trying to find out. So of course there's some hypothesis about, or some assumptions maybe rather, about the way people turn, or the situations in which people would turn to LLMs for questions, and the situated context in which they are when they do so, and so on. But this is one of the things we want to find out in one of the phases. And then when we have the context when we have a few context factors isolated, then we try to feed this into and build a system that uses them, and then we will actually also work with you, hopefully, when it comes to healthy distrust, to see how we then can actually also systematically remind people that they are conversing with a machine or with an LLM rather than with another human being, which we think is a very important when it comes to using LLMs in everyday life, which what everybody does now, but most people have like no idea, or they treat them like humans, and of course they're not. They have no idea how they work, and so this, I think, is another challenge then to constantly remind people that they're actually talking to an LLM and not a human.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually already an answer to the question I wanted to ask now, which is, where would you see yourself at the end of the second phase with respect to your research and on this question?
Mm-hmm. I mean, ideally, we will have effective interventions that really raise people's healthy distrust without affecting them negatively, and work for people with different background variables. And then we can, of course, in the third phase, bring this into fully interactive designs. Right now, at the end of the phase 2, we will likely study interactions of a relatively short time horizon, so maybe up to 60 minutes of people writing with the help of an LLM and then receiving explanations from our system. But if we envision it really also towards phase 3, then of course the question would be, how does the development of knowledge and healthy distrust work over an entire semester, for example, using this tool interactively over the entire time? And how will this affect maybe the broader educational context in which we are living? How does this affect AI literacy and interact with it? So there are really rich questions still to go for, even in phase 3, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe because I said about the one project, maybe about the other project, something that we hope to find out is when looking at the fitness tracker and context factor for this, we also look at how different context factors influence or have effects on the explanation in terms of the architecture or function of the explanandum. So I can explain something in terms of how it is built and what material it is built of, for instance, but I can also explain it rather in ways how it functions and what its goals are. And of course, with fitness trackers, we have something between a physical element or object and something that is not physical, which is the artificial intelligence, exactly, software algorithms behind it. So we are really interested to see how people build their explanations in terms of these two factors, architecture or functions or relevance, and we hopefully know a lot more about how context actually affects this. And this is something which I think is also very important for educational users, because explaining, for instance, algorithms, but also explaining other things like physical objects, you would always switch between these two aspects of an object. And of course, it's a lot more challenging to explain an object that's actually not physically there. So we hopefully know a lot more about this by the end of phase 2 and how context factors influences, with the hope that then we can see in the phase after, in the third phase, how we can bring this into application in different educational contexts, for instance.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking very much forward to the end of, well, actually now I'm looking very much forward to the second phase itself, but I'm curious what is going to happen at the end of the second phase. Thank you very much for being here, for letting us see into your research. That was really, really interesting. And thanks for the listeners. And many thanks for listening. If you like this episode, stay tuned.
Explaining explainability. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you have any questions about this topic, feel free to ask them in the comments. We look forward to welcoming you to our next episode.